The sun was setting over the city skyline, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Michelle Thompson, one of the city's most respected civil rights attorneys, was driving home after another long day at the office. Her mind was still running through the cases she'd been working on, families seeking justice, communities fighting for their rights. The gentle hum of her car's engine and the soft R&B playing on the radio were helping her unwind. The digital clock on her dashboard read 7:45 p.m. She'd stayed later than usual at the office, perfecting a crucial motion for tomorrow's hearing. Her silver sedan smoothly navigated through the evening traffic, brake lights glowing softly in the growing dusk. The streets were quieter now, with most people already home for dinner. Michelle checked her rearview mirror, something she did regularly, a habit inherited from her father who'd taught her to always be aware of her surroundings. That's when she first noticed the police cruiser. It had been following her for the past few blocks, keeping a steady distance. She mentally reviewed her driving, speed limit perfect, all signals used, no traffic violations. Still, her heart rate picked up slightly. Years of experience representing clients in civil rights cases had taught her that sometimes following all the rules wasn't enough. At the intersection of Oak and Main, where the local coffee shop was just closing for the day, the cruiser's lights suddenly flashed to life. Blue and red reflections bounced off the buildings around her, creating an almost surreal light show. Michelle took a deep breath and did what she'd advised countless clients to do. She turned on her interior light, kept both hands visible on the steering wheel, and pulled over smoothly into a well-lit area near a busy convenience store. Through her side mirror, she watched Officer Richard Barrett step out of his patrol car. His hand was already resting on his weapon, an unnecessary gesture that sent a clear message. Michelle started her phone's recording app, placing it carefully on the passenger seat. The approaching footsteps were deliberate, unhurried, almost theatrical in their slowness. The tap on her window was unnecessarily loud, aggressive even. Michelle pressed the button to lower it, maintaining her professional composure despite the growing tension. The scent of coffee from the officer's recent break mixed with the cool evening air that now filled her car. License and registration, Barrett demanded, skipping any pretense of courtesy. His flashlight beam swept across her face, then her car's interior, far more thoroughly than necessary for a routine traffic stop. Michelle noticed he hadn't stated any reason for pulling her over, another red flag she'd seen countless times in her cases. "Good evening, officer," she replied calmly, her voice steady and clear. "May I ask why I'm being stopped?" She reached slowly for her purse, keeping her movements deliberate and visible. The leather of her handbag creaked softly as she retrieved her wallet. Barrett's response came with a sneer that would be clearly visible on her phone's recording. "You looked suspicious making that turn back there." It wasn't true. She'd made no turns in the last several blocks, and they'd both knew it. This was about something else entirely. As Michelle handed over her license and registration, her fingertips brushed against her business card, the one that identified her as a partner at Thompson and Associates Civil Rights Law. She'd won several high-profile cases against the department in recent years. Maybe that's why Barrett's expression shifted when he read her name, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. The next few moments would change everything, not just for Michelle and Barrett, but for their entire community. The routine traffic stop was about to become anything but routine, and the events that followed would spark a movement that neither of them could have anticipated. Looking up at the officer's increasingly hostile stance, Michelle's mind raced through her options. Her phone was recording, there were witnesses at the convenience store, and she knew her rights. What happened next would test everything she believed in, both as a lawyer and as a human being standing up for dignity and justice. Officer Barrett's flashlight beam lingered on Michelle's law firm business card a moment too long. The air grew thick with tension as he walked back to his patrol car, her license and registration in hand. Through her rearview mirror, Michelle could see him speaking into his radio, his movements sharp with barely contained anger. She used these moments to send a quick location pin to her colleague Linda, a habit they developed after years of hearing similar stories from their clients. The convenience store's fluorescent lights cast long shadows across the street. A young couple had paused by the entrance, pretending to check their phones while actually watching the scene unfold. They'd seen enough news stories to know when something didn't feel right. Inside the store, the clerk had positioned himself near the window, his phone discreetly held at waist level. When Barrett returned, his entire demeanor had changed. Gone was any pretense of professional conduct. His boots scraped against the asphalt with deliberate slowness, like a countdown to something inevitable. Michelle's dashboard clock showed that 12 minutes had passed, far too long for a routine traffic stop. "Step out of the vehicle," Barrett ordered, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. The words hung in the cool evening air like smoke. Michelle's legal training kicked in, along with the countless workshops she'd conducted on knowing your rights. "Officer Barrett," she responded, keeping her voice steady and professional, "I haven't violated any traffic laws. Unless you can state the reason for this stop, I'm not legally required to exit my vehicle." She made sure to speak clearly, knowing her phone was still recording every word. His reaction was immediate and disturbing. "I said get out." Barrett's voice rose sharply as he yanked her car door handle. The sudden violence of the action made the whole car shake. Michelle's heart pounded, but years of courtroom experience helped her maintain her composure. 2 more people had stopped on the sidewalk now, their phones raised like shields. A city bus slowed as it passed, passengers pressing against the windows. Everyone knew they were witnessing something wrong, something that happened far too often in their city. Barrett's next move crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. He reached into the car, unfastening Michelle's seatbelt with one rough movement. "You people never learn to just comply," he growled, the words dripping with prejudice. His badge caught the streetlight, number clearly visible to all the recording phones. Michelle's voice remained remarkably calm, even as her hands gripped the steering wheel tighter. "Officer, I'm a licensed attorney, and you're violating multiple protocols right now. I suggest you step back and call your supervisor." She knew the words probably wouldn't help, but they needed to be on record. The situation was balancing on a knife's edge. More bystanders had gathered, their presence both a comfort and a concern. Michelle could hear someone in the crowd already on the phone with 911 describing the scene in urgent whispers. The convenience store clerk had stepped outside, his phone now obviously recording. Barrett's radio crackled with the dispatcher's voice, but he ignored it. His face had taken on a reddish hue, visible even in the mixed lighting of street lamps and police lights. The veins in his neck stood out as he leaned into Michelle's car, close enough that she could smell the coffee on his breath. Time seemed to slow down as Barrett's control completely unraveled. His next actions would be replayed thousands of times on news channels and social media, analyzed by experts, and used in police training sessions as an example of everything wrong with the system. But in that moment, it wasn't about future implications or viral videos. It was about one person's dignity and right to safety being violated while the world watched. The evening air carried the sounds of distant sirens growing closer. Whether they were responding to the bystanders' calls or something else entirely remained to be seen. But everyone present knew they were about to witness something that would change their community forever. The only question was, how far would Officer Barrett go, and how would Michelle protect herself while staying within the bounds of the law she'd spent her life defending? Everything happened in a matter of seconds. Officer Barrett's frustration boiled over, and his hand shot through the car window. The strike came without warning, a sharp, unprofessional move that revealed just how far he'd strayed from his training. Michelle, however, wasn't the defenseless target he'd expected. Years of dedication to self-defense training kicked in automatically. Her body responded before her mind could even process what was happening. 3 times a week for the past decade, she'd practiced at Master Chen's downtown studio, not because she ever wanted to use these skills, but because her mother had always told her to be prepared for anything. As Barrett's arm came in for a second swing, Michelle's muscle memory took over. A simple deflection, just like she'd practiced hundreds of times on Tuesday evenings. Her arm came up smoothly, redirecting his force away from her face. The movement was controlled, defensive rather than aggressive, exactly what Master Chen had always emphasized. "Officer, stand down." Her voice rang out clear and strong, carrying to the growing crowd of witnesses. Her phone continued recording from its perfect angle on the passenger seat, capturing every moment of Barrett's unprofessional conduct. The convenience store's security cameras whirred quietly above, adding another layer of documentation to the unfolding scene. Barrett stumbled backward, shocked by her skilled defense. His face twisted with a mix of surprise and anger, clearly unused to having his authority challenged in such a way. The gathered crowd let out a collective gasp, followed by murmurs of approval. Someone in the back started clapping, the sound echoing off the building walls. More phones had appeared in the hands of bystanders, their camera lights creating a constellation of small, bright points in the growing darkness. The young couple from the convenience store had moved closer, making sure to capture every detail. The store clerk had positioned himself near his security camera monitor, ensuring nothing would be accidentally deleted. "I have it all on video," shouted someone from the crowd. "We all saw what you did." Another voice joined in, "We're your witnesses, ma'am." The support from strangers warmed Michelle's heart, even as she maintained her focus on the volatile situation at hand. Barrett's radio crackled again, more insistently this time. Backup was finally responding to the multiple 911 calls. The sound of approaching sirens grew louder, their wail bouncing off the buildings of the quiet evening street. Red and blue lights began reflecting off windows from both directions. Help was coming, but the question was, whose help? Michelle remained in her car, hands visible on the steering wheel, her breathing steady despite her racing heart. Her training, both legal and physical, had prepared her for moments like this, though she'd always hoped she'd never need to use either. The small bruise forming on her cheek would be documented later, another piece of evidence in what was quickly becoming a much bigger story. Through her windshield, she could see Barrett pacing, his authority challenged in a way he'd clearly never experienced. His hands kept moving from his belt to his radio and back, indecision written across his face. The crowd had grown larger, forming a loose semicircle around the scene. Their phones remained raised, recording every move, every gesture, every moment of this incident that would soon make headlines across the country. "Officer Barrett," Michelle called out, her voice still professionally calm, "I suggest you wait for your supervisor. We can discuss your actions when they arrive." Her words carried the weight of someone who knew exactly how the legal system worked, not just in theory, but in practice. The slight tremor in her voice wasn't from fear, but from controlled adrenaline. The first backup unit turned the corner, lights flashing but sirens now silent. The arriving officers would find a scene very different from what they might have expected. A professional woman, clearly in control of herself, surrounded by supportive witnesses, with multiple recordings of what had truly happened. This wouldn't be another case of one person's word against an officer's. Technology and community had changed that dynamic forever. As more patrol cars arrived, Michelle took a deep breath. The next few minutes would be crucial. She knew the system, knew how these situations could be twisted and turned. But she also knew that the truth had a power all its own, especially when captured from multiple angles, witnessed by dozens, and supported by years of legal expertise. The night was far from over, but the worst part had passed, and she'd handled it exactly as she'd trained to do, with dignity, control, and an unwavering commitment to justice. Red and blue lights painted the street like a chaotic light show as 3 more police cruisers pulled up to the scene. The first to step out was Sergeant Reynolds, a veteran officer with salt and pepper hair and tired eyes that had seen too many incidents like this. Her presence immediately changed the atmosphere. She was known in the community for her fair handling of difficult situations. Michelle's phone continued recording as she calmly explained the situation to Sergeant Reynolds, her voice steady despite the adrenaline still coursing through her system. The small crowd that had gathered remained supportive, their own phones documenting every word, every gesture, creating an undeniable record of truth. "I want to file a formal complaint," Michelle stated, her legal training evident in her precise language. Officer Barrett initiated an unprovoked physical assault, which was captured on multiple devices. She gestured to her phone, still perfectly positioned on the passenger seat. The bruise on her cheek was beginning to darken, a visible testament to Barrett's loss of control. The convenience store owner, Mr. Patel, stepped forward with purpose. "I have everything on my security cameras," he announced, his voice carrying across the now quiet street. "All 4 angles, clear as day, and I've already backed up the footage." He'd seen too many instances of surveillance footage mysteriously disappearing not to take precautions. The young couple who'd witnessed everything from the beginning approached Sergeant Reynolds. The woman, a local nurse named Emmy, spoke first. "We saw the whole thing. We're willing to give official statements." Her partner nodded, adding, "We already uploaded our videos to the cloud. Everything's timestamped." Officer Barrett stood off to the side, his earlier bravado deflated under the weight of so many witnesses and recordings. His supervisor, Lieutenant Chen, had arrived and was speaking to him in low, serious tones. The look on the lieutenant's face suggested this wasn't the first time they'd had such a conversation. Michelle's colleague Linda arrived, having received the location pin earlier. As one of the city's most respected civil rights attorneys, her presence added another layer of gravity to the situation. She immediately began collecting contact information from witnesses, her years of experience telling her this case would be significant. "Your dashcam was running, correct?" Michelle asked Sergeant Reynolds, who nodded in confirmation. "And I assume the body cameras of all responding officers are active." Another nod. The evidence was mounting, creating an airtight record of the evening's events. A local news van pulled up quietly, drawn by the multiple police cars and gathered crowd. The reporter, Rachel Chen, was known for her fair coverage of community issues. She stayed at a respectful distance, gathering initial details from willing witnesses rather than rushing in with cameras blazing. The bruise on Michelle's cheek was photographed and documented by both the police and Linda. Each image, each report, each witness statement added another piece to the puzzle that would soon become a landmark case. But for now, in the immediate aftermath, it was about maintaining composure and ensuring everything was properly recorded. Mr. Patel brought out bottles of water for Michelle and the witnesses, a small gesture of support that meant more than he knew. The community had come together in a way that showed times were changing. No longer would incidents like this be hidden or ignored. As statements were taken and reports filed, Michelle's phone buzzed with messages from other lawyers at her firm. News traveled fast in legal circles, and they were already preparing for what would become a significant civil rights case. But Michelle's thoughts weren't on lawsuits yet. They were on the bigger picture, on how this incident could lead to real change. Sergeant Reynolds approached with the preliminary paperwork. "We'll need you to come to the station to file a formal complaint," she said, her tone professional but sympathetic. "And I want you to know that this will be thoroughly investigated." The sincerity in her voice suggested she meant it. The crowd slowly began to disperse, but not before several people shared their contact information and video footage with Linda. The young nurse, Emmy, made sure Michelle had her number, saying firmly, "Whatever you need, we're here to support you. This has to stop." As the night deepened and the immediate crisis passed, Michelle felt a mix of emotions: anger at the injustice, pride in her response, and hope for the change this incident might bring. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a message from her mother. Somehow, news had already reached her family. "Are you okay?" the message read. "Do you need me to come?" Michelle looked around at the scene. The police cars with their flashing lights, the supportive faces of strangers turned allies, the careful documentation of every detail. "I'm okay," she typed back. "And this time, we have proof. This time, things will be different." The law firm's conference room buzzed with activity early Monday morning. Michelle sat at the large oak table, surrounded by stacks of papers and open laptops. Her colleague Linda was reviewing the witness statements, while their paralegal Tom organized the video evidence from multiple sources. The bruise on Michelle's cheek had darkened over the weekend, a visible reminder of why they were all there. "We've got 37 witness statements," Linda announced, adjusting her reading glasses. "Plus surveillance footage from 4 different angles, dashcam video, and at least 20 civilian recordings." She smiled slightly. "This might be the most well-documented case we've ever handled." The local news channels had been running the story since Saturday morning. Mr. Patel's security camera footage played on screens across the city, showing the incident from multiple angles. The police department's public affairs office had already issued a carefully worded statement about investigating the incident thoroughly. Michelle's phone hadn't stopped buzzing with messages of support. The young nurse, Emmy, had helped organize a community support group on social media. Their page already had thousands of followers, all demanding accountability and change. But Michelle knew that real change would come through careful legal work, not just public outrage. "Look at this," Tom called out, pointing to his screen. He'd been reviewing Officer Barrett's service record, which they'd obtained through official channels. There's a pattern here. 6 complaints in the last 3 years, all with similar details, but none of them had this level of evidence. The legal team worked methodically, building their case piece by piece. They weren't just filing a simple complaint, they were preparing a comprehensive lawsuit that would address systemic issues. Michelle's personal experience would be the catalyst, but the goal was much bigger than one incident. By Wednesday, their initial filing was ready. It named not just Officer Barrett, but also addressed department policies, training procedures, and oversight mechanisms. The document was thick with exhibits, each one carefully labeled and cross-referenced. This wasn't just about seeking justice for one incident, it was about creating lasting change. Channel 7 wants to interview you, Linda mentioned during their lunch break. They were eating sandwiches from the deli downstairs, taking a brief rest from their intense work. They're doing a special report on police accountability, but only if you feel ready. Michelle considered it carefully. Her mother had always taught her that speaking up wasn't just a right, it was a responsibility. Set it up, she decided. But make sure they understand we're not just talking about my case. This is about something bigger. The interview aired the following evening. Michelle spoke clearly and professionally, focusing on facts rather than emotions. She discussed the need for better training, stronger oversight, and real consequences for misconduct. The station's phone lines lit up with calls from others sharing similar stories, though few had the same level of evidence. Lieutenant Chen from Internal Affairs visited the firm on Friday. Unlike some of his colleagues, he seemed genuinely concerned about improving the department. We've placed Officer Barrett on administrative leave, he informed them, and we're reviewing all his previous cases. The lieutenant's tired eyes suggested he'd been working long hours on this investigation. The courthouse clerks were waiting when Michelle filed the lawsuit Monday morning. Word had spread, and several other lawyers lingered in the filing office, wanting to witness this moment. The stack of documents was impressive. Evidence, testimonies, legal precedents, all carefully organized to tell a compelling story. Back at the office, more stories were coming in. People who'd faced similar situations but hadn't known how to fight back. Michelle's case was giving them hope, showing them that the system could work if you had enough evidence and the courage to stand up. The police union's lawyers will fight back hard, Linda warned during their strategy meeting. They always do. But Michelle wasn't worried. The evidence was solid, the witnesses were credible, and public opinion was strongly on their side. More importantly, they had truth and justice on their side. As the sun set over the city skyline, Michelle stood at her office window, reflecting on how one moment could spark such significant change. Her phone buzzed with another message, this time from Mr. Patel. His security cameras had caught another incident, not as serious but still concerning. "Will you help?" his message asked. Michelle typed back immediately, "Send me the footage." This was why she'd become a lawyer in the first place, to help people stand up for their rights, to fight for justice, to make real change happen. The bruise on her cheek was fading, but her determination was stronger than ever. The community center's meeting room was packed on a warm Tuesday evening. People sat shoulder to shoulder in folding chairs, while others stood along the walls. The air conditioning struggled to keep up with the crowd, but nobody seemed to mind. They were all there for something more important than comfort. Michelle stood at the front of the room, her presentation slides showing key points about knowing your rights during police encounters. The bruise on her face had faded, but the impact of her experience had only grown stronger. Mr. Patel had brought samosas for everyone, the smell of warm spices filling the air as people passed the plates around. "It's not about being confrontational," Michelle explained, her voice carrying to the back of the room. "It's about knowing your rights and staying calm." She clicked to the next slide, showing proper documentation techniques. Your phone is your most powerful tool. Video evidence can make all the difference. Emmy, the nurse who'd witnessed the original incident, had helped organize these weekly community meetings. She sat in the front row, taking notes to share on their growing social media platform. Their page had become a resource for the whole city, sharing information about legal rights, community support, and positive police interactions. "The key is working together," Michelle continued, gesturing to the diverse crowd. When Mr. Patel shared his security footage, when all those witnesses stayed to give statements, that's what made the difference. We're stronger as a community. Lieutenant Chen had surprised everyone by accepting their invitation to speak. He stood now, addressing the crowd with honest humility. "We're making changes in our training," he announced. "What happened that night showed us where we need to improve. We're here to protect and serve all of our citizens." The local news station had sent a young reporter to cover the meeting. She stood quietly in the corner, capturing the scene of police and community members talking openly about difficult issues. This wasn't the usual confrontational story. This was about people working together for real change. During the break, people shared their own stories. A retired teacher talked about starting a youth program to build better relationships with local police officers. A business owner described how she'd installed security cameras to help protect everyone in her neighborhood. Each story added another thread to the fabric of community action. "We've started a scholarship program," Michelle announced in the second half of the meeting. Her law firm had created a fund to help young people pursue careers in public service, whether in law enforcement or civil rights law. Change happens when we invest in our future. The police department had taken notice. New training programs were being developed, focusing on de-escalation and community relations. Officer Barrett's case had become a teaching tool, an example of what not to do and how quickly things could go wrong. Linda arrived late, coming straight from court. She had good news to share. The case was moving forward, and other departments were already requesting copies of their reform proposals. "They want to be proactive," she explained. "Nobody wants to be the next headline." As the meeting wound down, people lingered to talk. A group of teenagers asked Michelle about law school. An elderly gentleman shared stories about how things used to be and how proud he was to see positive changes happening. The air was filled with hope and determination. Outside, the summer evening was cooling off. People stood in small groups in the parking lot, exchanging phone numbers and making plans for future initiatives. The reporter interviewed a few community members, capturing the spirit of cooperation that had grown from one difficult night. Michelle's phone buzzed. Another message from her growing network of community activists. A neighboring city wanted to start similar meetings. "Can you help us get started?" they asked. She smiled as she typed her response. "Of course. We're all in this together." Driving home, Michelle passed the spot where it had all started. The convenience store was still there, Mr. Patel's cameras still watching over the street. But something had changed in the neighborhood. People walked with more confidence, looked out for each other more. One incident had sparked a movement, and that movement was changing lives. This wasn't just about one night or one video or one case. It was about building bridges, creating understanding, and making real, lasting change. As Michelle parked her car, she noticed a group of kids playing basketball with a young police officer at the community court. Small steps, she thought, but in the right direction. The courthouse steps were crowded on the final day of the hearing. 18 months had passed since that fateful traffic stop, and the city had changed in ways nobody could have predicted. Michelle stood at the top of the steps, surrounded by her legal team and community supporters. The morning sun caught the silver threads in her hair. Stress had added a few more over the past year and a half. Inside the courtroom, every seat was filled. Mr. Patel sat in the front row, his convenience store now closed for this important morning. Amy, the nurse who'd witnessed everything that night, had taken a day off work to be there. Even Lieutenant Chen attended, representing the police department's commitment to change. The judge's decision was clear and decisive. Officer Barrett's actions were found to be unconstitutional and discriminatory. But more importantly, the ruling mandated specific changes in police training, oversight, and accountability. The decision would affect not just one officer or one department, but would set a precedent for the entire state. "This isn't about punishment," Michelle told the reporters gathered outside. "It's about making sure our community is safer for everyone, citizens and police officers alike." The cameras captured the determined look in her eyes, the same look that had faced down injustice that night 18 months ago. The changes were already visible. The police department had implemented new training programs, focusing on de-escalation and community relations. Body cameras were now mandatory, and the footage was regularly reviewed. Officer Barrett had been terminated from the force, and several other departments had followed suit with their own reform measures. Back at the community center, a celebration was underway. Not a celebration of victory over the police, but a victory for the community as a whole. Officers mingled with residents, sharing coffee and conversation. The walls were covered with photos showing the progress of their various initiatives, youth programs, community forums, joint training sessions. "Remember when we first started meeting here?" Linda asked, looking around the crowded room. "We could barely fill the front row." Now they had to use overflow rooms for their monthly community meetings. People from other cities regularly attended, taking notes and sharing ideas. The scholarship program had its first graduates. 3 young people who'd been inspired by the case were now in law school, while 2 others had entered the police academy. They represented the future, people who understood both sides of the issue and were committed to making things better. Michelle's phone buzzed constantly with messages from other communities seeking advice. Her small law firm had grown, adding specialists in civil rights and community relations. They'd handled similar cases across the state, each one building on the precedent set by their landmark case. "Tell us about the new training program," a reporter asked Lieutenant Chen. He smiled, genuine pride in his voice as he described the changes. Officers now spent time working with community groups, learning about the neighborhoods they served. The us versus them mentality was being replaced by a spirit of cooperation. The statistics told the story. Complaints were down, community trust was up, and both citizens and officers reported feeling safer. Other cities were taking notice, sending representatives to learn from their experience. The ripple effect was spreading far beyond their original expectations. Mr. Patel's convenience store had become a symbol of community vigilance. His security cameras still watched the street, but now they were part of a larger network of community safety measures. Local business owners worked together with police, creating safer neighborhoods for everyone. As the celebration continued, Michelle stepped outside for a moment of quiet reflection. The street looked different now, not because it had changed physically, but because the people had changed. Neighbors looked out for each other. Police officers greeted residents by name. Trust was being rebuilt, one interaction at a time. Her mom called, as she did every week. "I'm so proud of you," she said, her voice warm with emotion. "You didn't just win a case, you changed things." Michelle smiled, watching a patrol car stop so the officer could play basketball with some kids at the community court. The sun was setting as people began to leave the celebration. Plans were already being made for next month's community meeting. A group of teenagers, future lawyers and police officers among them, stayed to help clean up. They talked excitedly about their plans to continue building on the foundation that had been laid. Michelle's final statement to the press summed up the journey. This was never about one incident or one person. It was about showing what's possible when people come together, stand up for what's right, and work to make real change. We're not finished, we're just getting started.